This is not Melissa Breau. I am Crystal Wing, but you are still listening to the Finzi Dog Sports Podcast, which is brought to you by the Finzi Dog Sports Academy, an online school dedicated to providing high-quality instruction for competitive dog sports, using only the most current and progressive training methods. Today, I'm subbing in for Melissa because we'll be talking to Melissa about her upcoming class, Coming Together Reliable Recalls for Real Life, which she's teaching this June at FDSA. Hi, Melissa. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Crystal. Thanks for subbing for me today.
Thank you for asking. I'm like, yeah, buddy. I'm like, thanks for picking me.
Yay! I'm so glad.
So as usual, to start us out, can you please share a little about yourself, your background, your current dogs, and what you're working on with them?
Yeah, so other than hosting the FDSA podcast, which, it's my usual role, I'm a web designer by trade, so that's what I do with, 90% of my life. But I like to joke that I was kind of born into the dog world. So both of my grandmothers were breeders. My dad's mom bred poodles. My mom's mom bred English Cockers. And my parents met in junior handler class. So
wow,
really, truly all the way dog things all the time. And I have a distinct memory from sometime in elementary school actually attending obedience classes with my grandmother who was teaching them at the time. So,
whoa.
been in the industry one way or another for quite a while. Over the years, I've taught local dog training classes here in North Carolina, pet classes mostly, and I compete with my own dogs in a variety of sports. We've trained in all sorts of stuff, including Tribal, which I now teach at FCSA. So, that's the fancy stuff. Right now I have two dogs. So I have Levi, he's a 9-year-old English Cocker Spaniel, and I have Huey, who's my almost 5, he's 4 years and 7 months, Labrador Retriever.
And what are you guys doing together?
All the things. So we've got, we're working on some obedience stuff. I'd really love to get into the obedience ring with both of them later this year.
Oh, nice.
They've got quite a bit of agility training, though we're not actually competing in agility. We play Frisbee, all sorts of disc and up dog stuff. That's our, probably the thing we've done the most of actual competition level stuff in. And yeah, I think those are most of our sports.
So you definitely have a great idea of recall, because especially I'm thinking about agility and thinking about disc dog, you have to be able to get your dog back. But when you think about a real life recall, how is that different from the kind of recall people needed from formal obedience?
Yeah. So when I think about a formal obedience recall, right, it's really set up. So you go into the ring, you leave your dog usually in a sit stay. You're walking across the ring, you're turning around, you're facing your dog, you're waiting for an indication for the judge, you're recalling your dog, they're coming to front position, which is a very formal, official position, right? And then you're going to finish your dog to your side and continue whatever to the next exercise. That's super different than if you were out in the real world, not in a super controlled environment with a very precise exact setup, and you need your dog to come to you. So if you are at the dog park, if you are off-leash hiking with your dog, if you're out in the yard and there's a car coming, if there's, any of those real life situations, what you actually need is to be able to call your dog and have them come to you and stay with you until you either release them back into the environment or until you leash them back up and go wherever it is you're going to go next. So those are very different pictures, both from the dog's perspective and kind of from the handler's perspective. And I really think they should be trained pretty differently.
So it sounds like it's easy to get some misunderstandings then. So what do you think people misunderstand most about teaching a reliable recall?
So if we're talking about a real life recall that people misunderstand, I think a lot of people kind of take it for granted. Like these little bitty puppies that are 8 weeks old and want to follow us everywhere and are happy to chase after us and, all those good things. And so
it doesn't last forever?
No. I hope it does. I'm not going to say never, because some people get really lucky, especially with their herding dogs. And, you get a puppy where as long as you, reinforce it a couple of times and they're pretty young, you end up with a recall that just never goes anywhere. It's always great.
Give me that one.
For the rest of us, we have to do some training. So I think a lot of time people kind of take it for granted. They get the baby puppy. The baby puppy's got a great recall. They never really break it out and train it. They never really think about it as a training project that they have to put some intention into. Again, sometimes we get lucky, but for the most part, it is a skill that the dog needs to learn, is a valuable skill for them to have. The second thing I think sometimes gets misunderstood is a lot of the times you have that little baby puppy recall and it carries you pretty far. And so people skip straight to proofing. right? They just are like, I have the basic behavior in a basic setup. Let me just make this really hard for the dog in all the ways. And then something breaks. And then all of a sudden we don't have a recall anymore. I think that's probably more common than people realize. But we really do need to think about teaching a recall and building reward history intentionally, and not just let's make this more difficult and see when our dog fails, right? And then kind of a third misunderstanding or misconception. I think people, Denise just wrote a post on this on Facebook the other day that I shared, but I think people have this idea that in order to recall your dog away from something exciting, you have to either have something more exciting or be more exciting than the other thing the dog is interested in. And I just don't think that's true. In my experience, it's really about building a really robust reward history for the behavior you're looking for. In this case, a recall. And basically training it to the point where the dog doesn't stop to think. They hear their word and they assume that coming to you is going to be incredibly, incredibly valuable because that's what their reward history tells them. And so they don't do a conscious analysis of thing A versus thing B. They just turn around and run to you. And that's really the type of recall that I want in my real life recall.
I loved that post. That broke a lot of people's brains.
It was so good.
It's a great misunderstanding because I felt that way for a very long time as well. It's like, well, I have to have something better than that. There's just some things that are never better. So I love that distinction. You did mention what your recall is going to be, but what exactly is a good recall? Like, what does that look like in everyday life?
Yeah. So I touched on a couple of those points, right? So the first thing for sure is that low latency, to talk about it in scientific terms, right? We say the cue, the dog turns around, they run to us immediately. So there's not a pause between when you say the cue and the dog stops to think about it. We don't want them to stop and think, because then they might decide the thing that they were doing was actually more interesting than coming to you. And that's just not the decision. We don't want that to be an option. So the second thing is, once they have turned around to come to you, I'm looking for a fast recall. I don't want my dog to kind of gradually walk in my direction as they get around to it, plodding along. I want whatever a fast speed looks like for my dog. I want them to do that when I call them, right? That they're going to run to me with some enthusiasm and motivation and oomph in their step. Once they get there, I really want a recall that doesn't result in a dine and dash. We've all seen a dine and dash recall, especially somewhere like the dog park or, in training class. You're trying to get your dog back to you. You call them, you hold out the cookie, they come, they steal the cookie, and they take right back off across the room, right?
I love that dine and dash. I'm going to steal that.
I don't think it's original. I'm sure I picked it up from somebody else.
But just in that context, I'd never thought about it. That's great.
Yeah. So we don't want a dine and dash recall. We want a recall that ends with a behavior that's predictable for us and predictable for the dog. So whether that means you're going to come to me and stay with me for some period of time, or whether that means you're going to come to me and I'm going to do a collar grab, right? We want to think about what that end behavior looks like and build it into our entire recall picture on a consistent basis, so that we know that once we call our dog, we've got our dog if something's happening where we need control. There are kind of two end behaviors I usually look at. I mentioned the collar grab. When training, the other option I look at is what I call buffet feeding. So we intentionally build in a reward sequence that involves multiple cookies, usually at least 3. And, initially it's come to me and I feed you 3 cookies basically as fast as I can. But over time, we space those out. So the dog is always anticipating more than one cookie, which teaches them to come to you and wait for that additional reinforcement, with some delay built in. And then kind of the third piece of a really good recall is that it works even in distracting places, right? We want a recall that's going to work even if there are other dogs in the room, even if, there's a really good smell over there, even if they kind of saw something out of the corner of their eye that's maybe equally interesting to you and whatever you've got. We really want to have built the reinforcement history that's going to hold up, even in situations where if the dog stopped to think, they might make different choices.
They are sentient beings. You are talking about reinforcement history. So why is that such a critical piece of the recall training?
I feel like I've said it 18 times already, but we don't want to teach the dogs to stop and think, right? We need a history that is so reinforcement heavy that they don't pause to evaluate. When we say come, they just come, right?
But do you only do it with cookies?
Doesn't have to be cookies. You can use all sorts of things. So funny enough, and just to emphasize the fact that it's really about the history of reinforcement, not the reinforcement itself. When I was teaching this class in person, I taught this class many, many, many times in person. We had a little Shih Tzu thing that was very overweight and on a vet required diet. Okay.
Okay.
So the two owners, who were fabulous human beings, came to class with this little Shih Tzu, and they're like, well, so we can't use really exciting reinforcement because our dog's on a diet. We can't use really good cookies. I said, okay, what can you use? And they said, carrots. We can use carrots. So they taught their dog to recall for carrots to the cue kitty cat. That was their chosen cue. And by the end of week 6 in the class, they yelled kitty cat, and that dog came flying across the room, away from me holding cookies, away from kind of whatever other distractions were present.
Wow.
But that's because we built the history, right? We built the individual pieces. In the class, what I recommend as homework is that you do 2 sessions a day, about 5 minutes each. And you can totally do one of these right before you feed your dog. You can build them into whatever part of your routine makes it really easy, a commercial while you're watching TV. And in that 5 minutes, I want you to do 10 recalls. So that means that ideally you're doing, 10 recalls twice a day for 20 recalls a day. And they don't need to be big recalls, right? We don't need to call the dog across the house. We don't need to, the dog can be sitting in front of you and you say your recall word and you feed them some of the time, right? Like that can be a rep. But if you practice twice a day, 20 recalls a day, 7 days a week, right? So we've got 1 week, we've got 140 recalls by the end of week 1. By the end of week 6, that's 840 reps.
That's some fast math.
I pre-wrote it out, don't worry.
I was like, whoa, what?
But if your dog is successfully recalled to a cue 840 times, what do you think is going to happen the 841st time that you use it?
Yeah, that expectation is there.
Exactly. You've just built the behavior, right? It's a habit. It's so instinctive at that. The dog doesn't stop and think about it. They really, truly do just do the thing because it's what they've done 800 and something times.
Yeah.
And your dog's going to do the thing. The dog knows the dog's going to do the thing, right? There's a high degree of confidence on everybody's part that what's going to happen is very predictable. So when I'm talking about building reinforcement history, that's really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about doing the reps so that everybody on the team knows that this is just what we do. This is just how this works.
Yeah. I'm listening to what you said about reinforcement. So it's about the history, but so like carrots for that dog, it could be kibble for another. It could be toys for another. Like how do you choose that reinforcement?
Yeah, for sure in class, we do a little bit of analysis of what your dog finds most valuable. Like that's like exercise I do want people to think through. But honestly, when I'm working on recalls with my own dogs, I try to look for opportunities in everyday life when I might be giving my dog something they're excited to get and insert a recall practice into that, right? So like, let's say this happened last night. I ordered Cookout cheese bites and didn't finish them on my way home, right? So I had 4 cheese bites left when I got home. Cool.
That's impressive. You didn't finish them? I don't know how that's possible. I am totally in awe of you. Just saying, sorry.
But I came home with a couple of cheese bites that I wanted to share with the dogs. So rather than, I didn't plan this, but because I'm going to give the cheese bites to the dogs anyway, heck yeah, I'm going to use the recall cue before I give them that reinforcement. It's just an everyday thing, but it's a high value, exciting, novel thing that they're, certainly enthusiastic to receive. And it gives me an opportunity to add additional reinforcement history into that particular behavior. So you can do that if your dog's really excited to go outside. You can call your dog and then release them outside. You can do that if your dog is excited about getting out of the car at a new event or in a new space, right? You can do that if you're going to be playing with toys with your dog, for sure. I'm a little cautious about thrown toys with a recall just because we do want our dog to come to us and stay with us. Yeah. So it's a thing to think about. And it doesn't mean you can't use a thrown toy, but you just have to be a little more intentional and really think about how you're doing it. You might choose to feed a cookie, pause, and then throw the toy, for example. Or, you might just want to build some sort of extra sequence into that so that your dog isn't just learning to come to you ever so briefly and then take off again for the thing.
Dine and dash.
Except in this case, it's not dining. So I don't know. Yeah. You need another fancy term.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Maybe touch and toss. I don't know.
Yeah.
But our goal again is to be able to have our dog under control after that recall. So, if we do need to leash them up or we do need to, stop them from running into a road or whatever, we have that as options. So I just kind of build that piece into it. But Hopefully that answers the extra piece about
Yeah.
reinforcement. I think anything your dog finds valuable can absolutely be used as part of the process.
Yeah, I love your everyday part of that. Like you are absolutely layering it into every day. It's just something you can do all the time. That's what a gift. And for something that's such a valuable uh, behavior that we all need.
Yeah.
We did mention choice earlier. How does giving dogs choice actually improve their reliability rather than weaken it?
Yeah. So while we don't want our dogs to consciously stop and think on individual reps, right? Like we don't, if we're out in the real world and we're trying to recall our dog away from the road, we certainly don't want our dog to pause and think then. Or if we're trying to recall our dog because there's another dog in person approaching and we want to put our dog back on leash, we definitely don't want our dog to stop and think then. It does make sense to set up structured choices to teach our dogs that the right choice is to come to us. And so the way that I like to do that is I have a game I call the Magic Bowl game. And when we're playing the Magic Bowl game, the Magic Bowl has cookies in it when we send the dog to the bowl and has no cookies in it magically. They just disappear when I'm calling the dog to me instead. And so we intentionally set up reps of differing difficulty based on bowl placement and dog placement and human placement that allow us to teach the dog that if they make the wrong choice, there's no reinforcement available. Mm. So it's not setting them up to fail as much as possible. We don't want to do that. But we do intentionally set it up so that there's a chance that the dog is going to make a choice and that if they make the wrong choice, there's no reinforcement involved in that. So it's a very controlled, structured way of doing it rather than out in the real world where it can fail, but it does introduce that concept into the dog's brain where, right at that key portion of the learning process for this particular behavior, where essentially it introduces that like thought in the back of their brain that, when mom calls me, the other thing is going to become less interesting. Actually, it doesn't pay off to choose something else. What pays off the most is going back to, mom or dad or whoever's calling me.
So that sounds like it's also the layering in distractions, right? So
for sure.
How do you gradually build reliability around distractions?
Yeah, rep by rep, right? We start small. So we for sure use like a series of games in the class. We I usually start with really, really simple, easy games that my dog basically can't fail, and then keep it fun and reinforcing as we build things. I try to set up, we don't really want to test the dog to the point where they're making the wrong choice. I usually tell people in class that you shouldn't use your formal recall word unless you're willing to bet $100 that your dog is going to come to you. If you're not willing to bet $100, use something other than your formal recall word until the recall's really well trained. And by then you should be confident enough to bet $100, even in a pretty distracting environment, that your dog's going to come to you. Again, by the time you've done 800 reps.
Yeah, you've got some reps in your bank.
Yeah. You're willing to bet some money on the fact your dog's going to come. But, when it comes to distractions, I usually proof my recall, for lack of a better term, against moving things, against toys, against equal value treats, against sense, against movement, right? We take each of those components and break them out individually with different games and kind of teach the dog really truly coming to me is what pays off the best, right? Mm-hmm. We do it in a structured and controlled way. We're not like setting the dog up in an environment that's going to overface them or be really, really hard. We start really simple and we gradually build that up. So, for a dog that tennis balls are their be all end all, maybe there's a tennis ball in a box in the room that they can see, but they can't access, right? Mm. Or maybe it's up above where they can reach in the initial phases, right? It depends on exactly how ball crazy we're talking here.
Yeah.
But, eventually being able to progress to maybe that ball is rolling across the floor. And then maybe that ball is bouncing. And then maybe that ball is, each gradually taking that and moving it up and up and up and up and up and having the dog kind of make the right choice each time because we're splitting it finely enough and we're building up their success level enough with enough reps that ultimately, we still get the behavior we're looking for.
Nice. You mentioned kitty cat as a cue earlier, and then you said maybe don't use your formal cue. I'm just curious, what kind of cues have you heard or do you recommend or ones that stand out?
That's a really good question. I think my favorite two kind of different cues, kitty cat's certainly up there. That's pretty memorable. We used Yahoo in a couple of the classes. For me, for Huey, he's totally going to wake up when I say this, but like, if you think of like a pig call, like the suey, so I say Huey that way.
Oh, I love it.
Huey. He's awake. He's like, what? But
Poor Huey.
so, yeah, poor buddy. But anyway, so that's like his, his recall cue. That means like, really, no, really come right now. As we work through the class materials to make the sample videos, and so he decided he had to come say hi because, clearly.
Hi, Huey.
But as I work through the class materials, I'm teaching him kind of a more typical recall word, just like from scratch to make the videos and stuff. So we're using here for that. That is what I used with my German Shepherd, who I originally went through this material with years and years and years ago. Come is obviously a super common one. With me or to me is pretty common. Those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head anyway.
Do you think the tone matters?
For sure. I think if you want to be able to say your word in a lot of different tones and still have it result in the same behavior, you have to practice that, right? Like that has to be a part of the training.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, though, I think it's fine to pick a particular way of saying a word and use that as part of the recall cue so that it sounds the same way every time. The closer you can get to sounding the same way every time, the better. But obviously, when you're actually panicky and worried about something that's in the environment, you may not say it the same way that you have, 800 times before. So thinking about that and maybe intentionally varying it as you're practicing is helpful too.
Yeah. Or pick a tone that sounds like when you panic.
Right.
My friend did that. Hers is Ben. So it's a really sharp Ben.
And for what it's worth, I know somebody had asked me if they could work on a whistle recall in this class. And I don't see any reason that wouldn't work. It's just a cue, right? Like it's just the cue you choose to use and the rest of it.
That sound. Yeah. Nice. I'm curious, long lines, management tools, does any of that have a place in reliable recall and being safe about it?
For sure. So at some point, we need to go from working on really easy baby reps of our building reinforcement history in our house, in our living room, or in our basement, right? And take it into the real world. And at least initially, the handlers, at least if the folks that I'm working through the course material with in advance of the class to get some videos are any indication, a big piece of it is handlers aren't super confident their dogs are going to come. And so a long line or a fence really goes a long way towards giving you a chance to breathe.
Yeah. Breathing is good.
We do need oxygen. It's an important part of living.
And just that stress, like if we're feeling all stressed, I wouldn't want to come to me if I'm a stress ball.
For sure. Absolutely. That's a really good point. So, there's that from a safety perspective. The other thing about that is, having that long line gives you the option to work on a developing skill in a more difficult environment than maybe you're not willing to do an $100 bet quite yet in that particular environment. So we're going to build some baby skills first and then work on the more advanced stuff in that environment, right? And a lot of the times, I like to use, especially when we're working in new places, some games I learned from Deb Jones around focus and attention and starting a session. So one of the things that she does is she calls it rapid fire treats. And so essentially you feed your dog very quickly for free when you first get to a new place. If your dog can't eat 10 cookies for free, they for sure aren't going to be able to give you any measure of work. So start there. Yeah. The other thing that I used to do with my in-person classes is every time we went to we started in the training building with the facility. I'd set a 1-minute timer. And the goal during that is not to talk to your dog and not to kind of do anything to solicit their attention, but each time they check in, they get a cookie. And you count how many cookies you give. And so how hard is this environment for my dog? Well, in a known environment, my dog in a minute checks in an average of, 20 times, right? Yeah. Now I go to a new environment and I do that exact same exercise. And I say, how many times did my dog check in a minute in this place? Oh, he only checked in 4 times. This is a really hard space for him.
Yeah.
So I'm going to set up our training scenarios accordingly, right? I'm going to play easier games. I'm going to give him easier choices. I'm going to do things that increase the likelihood for success instead of really pushing our limits. Now, if I take my dog to a new place and maybe, at home or in our known training environment, we get 20 check-ins, and in this new place, we got 15. Well, I'm pretty close to as comfortable as at home, and I can probably push things a little more. I can probably do things that are a little more difficult. It just gives us a really good measure, kind of where our dog is mentally and how tuned in they are with, basically just a handful of cookies. So,
yeah, that's nice. I love that. I'm thinking about sometimes, I'll speak for other people, definitely not myself. Sometimes recall becomes inconsistent. I don't know how that would ever happen, or maybe optional. But if that's happened to someone, is it possible to rebuild a recall that's become optional?
Absolutely. I will say my favorite method for rebuilding an optional recall is to start over with a new cue. Absolutely, just rebuild it from the ground up. If it's once you have multiple reps, one rep isn't a big deal, like one failure isn't a big deal, but once you have a recall cue that your dog has learned is optional, it's just never going to be as reliable as a recall cue that's never failed, right? Obviously, like, dogs are not machines. Nothing's guaranteed. There's always a chance, even if you've done a ton of work on a recall, that your dog doesn't hear you one time or that something happens. And, failures occur. But if it is a thing where your dog is actually not recalling to you most of the time, or really seems to stop and think about whether or not they want to come, or look at you to see what you have before they decide whether or not they're going to come, just start over with a new cue. It's going to make your life easier. It's going to give you a better recall at the end of the game.
Yeah.
And if for some reason that's not an option, if you have a cue and it's just the word that comes out of your mouth, and that in an emergency situation, it's the word that's going to come out of your mouth, do the work. Start from the very beginning. Try not to use the cue other than in training while you're retraining it, and rebuild the value. Just start literally from scratch, where we say the word and we feed the cookie. Yeah. And, really teach the dog that thing that previously was a thing that you thought wasn't valuable for you truly has a lot of value associated with it.
I don't know if it's okay to share a quick story.
Yeah.
I gave that to my mom. She does animal rescue. And there were a couple dogs. She would say their name and say their name and say their name. And then she said, "You want a cookie?" And they would all come running in the house. And I was like, "Mom, you do realize your recall word is cookie, right?" So it goes to that reliability and that consistency. And so, yeah, it just made me think about that for some reason.
I mean, in my opinion, your recall word should be almost as consistently reinforcing as your marker cues.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Absolutely.
Like, if you think about your marker system, it literally means, hey, you're going to get a thing.
Yeah.
In Denise's example that she shared in that big long post she wrote, the thing that she called out was not necessarily Zen's recall. It was the word switch, which has a lot of value for him. Yes. And means a very specific thing and includes recalling to her as part of that behavior.
Yes.
And, that's such a reinforcement history and a habit for him. He didn't have to think about it.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're looking to do.
Yeah, I've had to do that where I don't actually use my recall word, but I've used my marker word. And then that kind of sunk in my head. I was like, wait a minute. What does that say about my recall word?
Your marker word has a higher reinforcement history than
it means recall. I need to take your class because
I'd love to have you.
Because we're talking about this because you are offering a new class. It's the Coming Together Reliable Recalls for Real Life. And it is through FDSA in June. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you want to share a bit more about the class or who might want to sign up? Because I'm signing up.
I hope you do. It'd be great to have you in class. So the class does start kind of at the very beginning. We assume you have no recall whatsoever. We're building value from the word entirely from scratch. And I think for some people, they're going to look at week 1 lectures and they're going to be like, oh, this is really easy. That's kind of the point, right? We want to have games that are super simple. Maybe even your dog already knows the game, and we're adding the recall picture into that so we have a foundation to build off of. We want those first, 140 reps to basically be really easy, really rewarding reps for your dog. That first week should be about, word means food, word means reinforcement, word means whatever that reinforcer is for your dog, but really intentionally building that piece. So the class starts at the beginning. We build all the way to a fairly proofed recall. I am trying to give you guys enough that, you can kind of work beyond the class if you want to. You can continue to build in new environments and advanced pieces. As far as who might want to take the class, if you've got a young dog, a puppy, somebody just about to hit that teenage year, it's a great time to take a recall class so that you've reinforced that thing, captured kind of that puppy follows me behavior, and now you're turning it into something that's a little bit more reliable that will kind of hold up as your dog gets a little bit older. Somebody who really wants to do off-leash hiking or really wants an off-leash reliable dog, great fit for this class. It's absolutely a great opportunity to build up those skills so that you're confident as the handler that if you get into a situation, you call your dog, they are going to come. And so that your dog actually has those skills at the level that you might want them. One note that this class is not for, if you do have a dog that's very prey obsessed, if you have a dog that like really truly wants to hunt and kill prey animals in the environment, or that I always think of Tracy McLennan's story about her own dog who would disappear into the woods for hours on end hunting prey.
Wow.
And she had no way of getting him back, right? If you are an extreme case in that type of scenario, Tracy does offer classes specifically for those types of dogs. And I don't have the same experience she does in that particular arena. So if that is your very particular nut that you can't crack, I'm going to recommend you take Tracy's classes instead. Certainly you could still work through the recall class. It won't hurt anybody, right? Like it's not going to do damage to your recall in any way, shape, or form. But you for sure will be best served by either also taking her class or taking her class instead, because that's really what she specializes in. She really understands that brain in the dog and like how that kind of fits into all of the sciencey bits for training around that particular issue. But otherwise, if you want a better recall, you're welcome. So
I'm thinking about my 2 retired seniors. I've kind of gone slack on my recall with them. So it might be good motivation for me to go, okay, guys, I know you're retired, but.
Yeah. What a fun way it really is just a series of fun games. And so just a little bit of using your brain and a little bit of, making the right choices and a little bit of focus stuff and a little bit of, doing the thing when I call you. Yeah. Now, I will say with the seniors, you've also got that hearing thing that maybe comes and goes a little bit, but
well, there's that. Yeah, but it's kind of an interesting, because I think about the puppies and then kind of the seniors become almost similar to the puppies in a lot of ways. So
for sure.
Yeah, this might be kind of fun for them. Yay, I'm looking forward to it.
I'd love to have them. So
yay. Well, it feels so fun to say this, but thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Melissa.
Thank you so much for having me, Crystal.
And definitely thanks to our listeners and our viewers, and now viewers, right, for tuning in. Melissa will be back in the host chair next week, this time with Brona Daly about dogs with big feelings around agility. If you haven't already, you should subscribe to this podcast because it rocks. It's either in iTunes or the podcast app of your choice, or now on YouTube. So be sure you never miss an episode. Today's show is brought to you by the Finzi Dog Sports Academy. Special thanks to Denise Finzi for supporting this podcast. Music provided royalty-free by bensound.com. The track featured here is called Buddy. Editing provided by Chris Lang. Thanks again for tuning in, and happy training.